All right, so welcome everybody. Again, my name is Brittany Like. I'm the program coordinator for Detroit Audubon. This is one of multiple webinars we offer throughout the year, so we usually offer them monthly. And this is our November webinar. We have Erik Wing joining us. I'll let him introduce himself, but just before we get started with that, just a reminder for everybody, the webinars are free. But we always welcome donations. That way we can guarantee these remain free. But they're not required, just if you decide to, just because it is our fall annual appeal. So again, welcome everybody. We're happy you could join us, and I'll pass over the screen over to Erik.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk with you all. Can you see my screen there? I think so, right? Let's see. There we go. Yeah, so I'm a researcher who does research on learning and memory, and I'm especially interested in how knowledge is acquired and the influence that knowledge has on other cognitive functions. So I'm really excited to talk with you all. I have been spending the last couple of years doing research that has been made possible by participants from the wider birding community. So I think this talk will probably be a little bit different than what you're used to, and I may have the distinction of being the least knowledgeable about birds anyways speaker that you all have had, but I hope you'll find the talk relevant nonetheless. Really, instead of being about birds themselves, this talk is about us and about how our interest in birds is actually changing our brains. So with that, I'll get into it with a little bit of backstory. I'm going to start talking about how I got into this research. I think there's a tendency in psychology and neuroscience to design studies. Oops, is that? Okay, I think that's probably better. To design studies and experiments and analyze information and assume that the kind of most important parts are the actual data files, the spreadsheets, or the brain scans, and kind of disregard the rest. But I think that's a mistake. So I'm going to share how I came to this research, partly as a general invitation to hear thoughts from other people about their own experiences with birds. In a way that's different from a lot of other areas of research that I've been involved with. This is really work that's progressed and been developed through discussion with other people who are interested in birds. And so I'm hoping we can continue that discussion at the end. Okay, with that said, the story starts back in 1934, thanks to some old files that my mom digitized a few years back after my grandfather Elisha passed away. These exchanges are actually with the Massachusetts Audubon Society, and they were found among my grandfather's letters, and they're just too good not to include here. So this is one from a Mr. Allen to my grandfather, age 12. And it reads, "Mr. Packard has handed me your bird list for 1933 and that of your brother Henry. Both these lists contain so many rare and unusual birds that we are wondering if they were all very thoroughly identified, or whether you may not have let your enthusiasm get the better of your judgment in some cases. I wonder if you or Henry or both of you could come see me at my office and go over the list with me. I should be glad to see you and to learn about some of the circumstances under which you saw some of your rarities." I guess this is the 1934 equivalent of getting your eBird observations flagged. But my grandfather apparently did go in. Here's the next letter in the exchange. And I guess my grandfather was persuasive. The funniest part is actually the note published subsequently in the bulletin, which reads, "His list seems so extraordinary for a boy of his age that the associate editor of the bulletin arranged an interview in which the young observer showed an intimate and accurate knowledge of field marks of birds in a calm and earnest manner such as to inspire confidence." At this age, by the way, I was mostly playing video games and hanging out at the mall, so it's a bit humbling to actually see these correspondences from the past. And I know that probably what a lot of people want to see is the actual checklist. So here are some of the highlights from what was published in that issue of the bulletin. Some of the names, kind of interesting to me, are different from what the modern names of these are. So here's the black-backed woodpecker. These are all mostly around the Boston area, kind of suburbs of Boston and New England more broadly. So black-backed woodpecker, which is referred to as Arctic three-toed woodpecker, Bohemian waxwing. There's also yellow-breasted chat, Western kingbird, which is printed as Arkansas kingbird, king rail, and loggerhead shrike. So interesting side note is to think about how the prevalence of these species have changed over time. A year or two back, I was at the wrap up for our local Toronto Christmas bird count, and some people had put together a tool that visualizes all of the Toronto area Christmas bird count data going all the way back to the start. It was really interesting to see some of the trends of birds over the years. Most of it, as you might expect, was not super encouraging, but there were species that have become more prominent over the years. So it's interesting to think about how that kind of maps onto this older historical data. Anyway, fast forward many years, and my mental model of birds at age 12 or age 22, for that matter, is basically this. But at some point when I was in grad school, things started to change. So growing up, I had known that house sparrows and starlings were both common birds, but I could not have told you which was which. And to be fair, this is basically most people's mental model of bird identification. If you've been studying birds a long time, sometimes it's hard to put yourself back in the mindset of everything being undistinguished and undifferentiated. My grandfather's enthusiasm for birds had actually passed on to my mother, who tried her best to instill some of that interest in me. And after years of resisting, I finally began to notice birds when I was out around walking in the woods anyways in grad school. The timing was somewhat fortuitous, actually, because during this period, I was doing neuroscience research on learning and memory for my graduate studies. And this made me particularly aware of how my mind was beginning to change as I learned more about birds. In fact, I knew so little about birds that things were really starting to reorganize quickly. And it's almost like I could feel the changes in my brain and perception happen month by month. So here's one confusion I remember from pretty early on. After seeing a blue-gray gnatcatcher, I looked through the entire Sibley guide and determined that the only thing it could have been was a Plummeus vireo, despite being in central North Carolina at the time. Fortunately, I wasn't submitting my highly dubious sightings to eBird at that point. This experience of being aware of new concepts getting formed and shifted became the basis for a lot of the work that I'll talk about next. The story of how one goes from mistaking birds for one another to a more organized mental space is really about neuroplasticity. So I'll give a few examples of that research before talking about things in the bird context. The most dramatic change in reorganization of brain networks occurs early in development, but there's now a lot of work studying brain changes that arise due to experience throughout the entire lifespan. So a lot of the early work on neuroplasticity proceeded on two assumptions. One, try and isolate regions of the brain that we know have a very specialized function, and two, target individuals or groups that have many decades of experience in a corresponding area. Here, this is a picture of auditory cortex highlighted in the bottom left. And this region is important for processing pitch and melodies and other kinds of acoustic inputs. And studies have found that auditory cortex is physically larger for professional musicians, which is thought to reflect increased connections between the brain cells and other cellular reorganization that occurs due to long-term use and long-term auditory processing. Here's another example of structural plasticity related to motor function. For individuals with certain fine motor skills like juggling or a specific musical instrument, there's evidence of changes to neuronal pathways and increased tissue volume in regions of motor cortex. So you can actually observe this reorganization in the structural brain measures. These changes are generally easier to see in regions of primary sensory brain cortex, like visual cortex or auditory cortex. But there are a lot of other domains where learning is not so tied to a single perceptual sense. The hippocampus is a brain structure that is particularly important for many forms of memory, as well as for spatial navigation. And a number of years ago, a group in the UK wanted to test whether expert navigators experienced any kind of, I think we're getting a little bit of, there we go. Whether expert navigators experienced any kind of physical change in navigational experience due to their basically learning new layouts and new configurations and new maps. So what they did is they recruited a group of London taxi drivers who had to complete this very extensive test called the knowledge that was basically learning about how to navigate at different locations around London. And I guess this is probably now obsolete due to Uber and GPS and stuff. And what they found is that in their sample of London taxi drivers, there was actually increased volume in posterior regions of the hippocampus, suggesting that the formation of an elaborate cognitive map produces changes in underlying brain structure. And, you know, of course, there's always questions about the causality of these effects. Could it be that people who are good navigators and who have larger hippocampal volumes become taxi drivers? Well, in follow-up longitudinal studies, the researchers actually tracked a group of novice taxi drivers pre-exam and found that those who went on to obtain their licenses and complete the extensive training were the ones that showed the brain changes, which suggests that this is actually a causal effect rather than a product of who self-selects to do different types of activities. Okay, what about in the visual domain? So vision processing in early stages basically follows this pathway from lower level characteristics of images like line orientation and shape, and steadily gets more more conjoint features and more complex as integrated representations form in interior regions. So a lot of the visual expertise work has happened to kind of map out this bottom surface of the brain, which is the visual pathway. And one of the main findings here is that there are regions of this visual pathway that are sensitive to different categories of information, including faces. Faces are probably the best known of these. So the previous findings I mentioned have been about brain structure, but the development of functional MRI has meant that it's possible to study some of these neural processes in a little bit more detail. And the selective response to certain parts of visual cortex to faces raised some questions about whether acquired visual recognition skills, like for birds, might rely on remapping of some of these face processing circuits that are found in visual pathways. Actually, early work did show some degree of face region sensitivity to areas of acquired experience. So here you can see that there are, this is a study with bird experts and car experts. And for the bird experts, there's more activation in this face processing region when they view birds, and vice versa for the car experts. So when the car experts saw car pictures, they had more activation in this face processing region. So the idea here is that acquired expertise in a domain might co-opt some of the mechanisms that evolved to support adaptive functions for social interactions. Okay. Okay. Let me know if you can't see this slide. So I would say that the current thinking is that this face processing kind of theory about expert vision is really just one component of much broader changes that are occurring as people become familiar with real world domains of information. And this makes sense, right? Because especially for an area like birds, there's so much information to draw on that's not even visual in nature. Early fMRI approaches examined average brain activity for category A versus category B, which made it very difficult to distinguish between categories unless they were really different from each other. So say faces versus complex scene pictures. And this issue has been partly addressed by new techniques that explore the distributed patterns of brain activity rather than average activity present in a region. These patterns can essentially serve as brain signatures for individual items, which is kind of amazing if you think about it. So here's a cartoon of something that we do in the MRI, show people a picture of a bird, and then look at the corresponding neural pattern that's associated with viewing this bird picture. So this pattern is going to be different in different regions, but say that this is the pattern for this bird in this blue region here. Now we show another bird and look at the corresponding pattern for that bird. How similar are these bird patterns to one another? Well, these two birds are pretty different. They're different colors. So maybe the patterns are not very correlated for these two birds. Then we show a third bird and we observe the pattern that's associated with that third bird. And here, let's say this one, well, it's got the same color as the first one. So maybe it's more correlated with that first bird than it is with the second one. And finally, another red bird. So maybe that pattern is going to be more correlated with the second bird picture than it is with any of the other ones. Now, if you're recording from a part of the brain like visual cortex that cares about color processing, this is actually a pretty plausible structure of those relationships, right? And if you don't have a lot of prior knowledge about birds, maybe this is actually the pattern that emerges in other parts of the brain as well, because what you're tracking is mostly this feature of color, and you're not paying attention to these other things, or you haven't learned about these other aspects that might give you clues to which one of these birds is more related to the other thing. So the point is that the relationships really depend on what part of the brain you're recording from, but also really depend on prior knowledge. What you know already is going to determine how your brain is responding to these birds and what the similarity between different bird patterns are to each other. There are definitely parts of the brain that care more about these abstracted concepts. And so if you know that the first two birds are actually the same species, maybe those regions are going to respond more similarly to the first two birds, even if their perceptual characteristics are more highly variable from one another. How about a photograph of a bird and a song of that species? Of course, if you're looking at the patterns in early sensory regions like visual cortex and auditory cortex, those are going to be totally different. But maybe there's some regions that care about the underlying concept and not so much about how that information gets into the brain in the first place. So we think that accurate identification is the product of different types of signatures in different regions, which are tuned through experience and learning. For example, an experienced brain might downweight the information coming from the color region if color is not necessarily a diagnostic feature in a certain context. Okay, so the relative importance of different bird features becomes obvious if you just ask people to sort birds by how similar they seem to one another. This data that I'll show here is from a recent study that we did where we just showed bird experts and novices sets of illustrations on the screen and asked them to judge how similar they were to each other. Basically just arrange them on the screen based on how similar you perceive these birds are to one another. And we didn't give them really any other instructions besides that. So the bottom plot here shows the average configuration for the novices. And the top plot shows the average configuration within the birder group. I know the illustrations are tiny, so don't worry about the individual bird pictures. One of the main things to notice, though, is that there are a few more kind of discrete tight clusters in the birder configuration than there are in the novices, where the birders are evidently detecting individuals that they appear to be highly similar to each other. And this makes a lot of sense overall because the set of birds, unbeknownst to the participants, the set of birds included 6 different families with different members in each one of those families. If you visualize the spatial distance between the different birds and different families, like in these heat maps, you can kind of see the emergence of this family structure. So here, these heat maps to the right show the overall distance between each bird and every other bird in the plots. And what you can see emerging from these heat maps is that there's this kind of more blocky structure in the bird experts, which is indicating that within each one of the families, they're grouping birds within that family, the different species, more closely together. Now, this is the case even though all of these birds are from different regions of the world, and we kind of confirmed afterwards that the participants didn't know the individual species here. So it's not like they are very familiar and they're just sorting all the ones that they know together. They're actually picking up on underlying structural properties, morphological properties to group birds that have similar taxonomic characteristics together, even if they don't necessarily know the structure or the individual birds themselves. And you can see this quantitatively if you fit a model that captures these taxonomic relationships. The birders are expressing more of this taxonomic relationship structure in their organization than the novices are. So what are the novices using to arrange these birds? This is the same type of model down here, except it's based on bird color instead of taxonomic relationships. So you can see that the novices are really kind of heavily informed by how similar colored birds are to each other in making these groupings. And just again, it's kind of intuitive that if the most kind of prominent feature that you have to go off of is color, then that's the one that's going to be important for organizing these different illustrations. Of course, color is important for bird identification, but it's important in context. And there's some contexts where it's less helpful and some contexts where it's more helpful. All this gets at a point that is sort of intuitive in birding, that accurate identification relies on a balance between separating subtle features, like you might need to distinguish between these very similar flycatchers, and equally important, integrating across sometimes variable aspects or dimensions that may not be as relevant for identification. Here are a bunch of different morphs of red-tailed hawk that are quite variable, but still all map onto the same concept. I think the intuitive notion in birding is the separation piece, but like I said, the other side of the coin is really this integration, the ability to draw connections between underlying concepts, even if things like superficial appearance or context change. We all know how much factors like bird age or molt or even lighting can have on identification. So if your search template is too narrow, you won't be able to identify a bird in more than one specific instance. Now, this gets really challenging, of course, when sometimes you have variation across different species being a lot smaller than the variation between individuals of the same species. And one interesting thing to study is how learning happens when you have this kind of mismatch, because really forces you to focus on a few features that are important, or sometimes to basically ignore other features that would be kind of the more obvious features to the average person, like what color a bird is. You can see how these notions of separation and integration play out even in the organization of different bird field guides. So here's the question: which one of these two images looks more like a real bird? doesn't even make sense, right? Obviously, the photo looks more like a real bird than the illustration of a bird. But many people prefer field guides, nonetheless, with illustrations rather than with realistic photos. Why? It's because the illustrations strip out a lot of the extraneous information that's present even in the most representative photo. So variations of lighting, photo background, bird age, breeding season, and so on. And this helps the process of separating and integrating by accentuating features that are useful for identification. Illustrations also allow the birds to be kind of presented, birds from the same genus or family next to each other, so that slight differences between them become more apparent, which is harder to do if you have all this rich visual information coming from photographs rather than from illustrations. In essence, bird identification relies on a conception of a bird species that is both somewhat stable and somewhat flexible. And again, we're talking about the kind of difference between separation and integration and learning the tuning or the variance that's associated with different features and what the possible range of various features can be. So for example, what's the density of streaking in a certain bird? What's at the upper end of that density and what's at the lower end of density, or a different feature, and you kind of stick all these features together and make an informed guess about what a specific bird is. So here's an example. First, you can try and figure out how many unique species are represented in these photos, and then which ones are the same as which other ones. So if you're just starting out and you don't have a lot of experience, these probably all look really similar. And to show you the answers here, I never know exactly which ones to include in this. Here's, so there's song sparrow, Lincoln sparrow, and fox sparrow here. Over time, you learn that the Lincoln sparrow streaks are a little bit neater, maybe thinner, and the fox sparrow streaks are a little bit more triangular, and song sparrow, maybe there's more variation there. So it's helpful to look at the head as well, or something like that. So over time, you're tuning for what the range is for each one of these features, slowly gets integrated in this conception that's somewhat flexible, but not infinitely flexible. And really, this learning process is something that we're particularly interested in, especially the different transitional stages of learning when these forces of separation and integration cause shifts in how different birds are perceived or recognized. Essentially, how do the mechanisms of neuroplasticity enable reorganization to support more efficient identification? So I'll show a very quick overview of some of our training protocols. For the ideal non-birder control participant, the starting mental model looks something like what I showed earlier, very little differentiation between those. And we can do a kind of baseline brain scan to see how the bird concepts fit together without any kind of training happening before that. Then we can do a baseline, after this baseline scan, we can do a brain kind of training where we teach people the different characteristics of some families, and they learn to discriminate different birds from each other. And I think I'll try and pull this up here and just show you a little bit what one version of this looks like. So this is the training that we're using. What we do here is show a single bird at the top and then ask what the name and family of the bird is. And after that response, it will show the name and family and then have people select which one of these photos is the matching one. So it starts out pretty easy. So you select the match and get feedback in the form of the corresponding illustrations that tells you whether you got it right or wrong. So it kind of continues like this. Sometimes there are two matches, so you can't always rely on just which one is the most similar. And both of the birds are matches. And sometimes it's easier and sometimes it's harder. So we just kind of train this over the course of a week, and we track people's feedback. Most of the participants seem to really enjoy this. I've used it for, when I'm traveling places, kind of load in a different set of birds. And then after this week-long training, we can bring people back and put them in the scanner again and kind of measure the reorganization. What we're really interested in here is, where do the neural signatures converge after learning, and where do they separate? How does the learning trajectory vary with the background of the participant? So we're studying this in both birders, but also in novices. And as you can imagine, it really matters what your prior knowledge is coming into this. And there are a lot of different learning pathways that are opened up by having a prior generalized template of these birds, even if you've never seen the individual species before. So one way to track the behavioral effectiveness of this training task is to measure matching performance. So here participants see two images back to back really quickly. There's first an illustration and then a photograph that appears after that. And they just have to respond whether the photograph matches the illustration, whether it's the same species, or whether it's a mismatched different species. So this is a buff-breasted flycatcher illustration with a matching photograph on the top, and then below is the same illustration with a mismatching Cuban vireo. When you look at overall performance, the experts are clearly better than the novices, but the degree of improvement after training is quite good. So the novices are learning which features to look for and which ones are the most important for differentiating the species, but then they have to do this abstraction piece by connecting these different perceptual formats of illustration to photographs. Of course, I should note that this improvement doesn't exactly map onto real world identification, right? There are a lot more factors that are going on when you're out and about looking at birds, but it's good to see this size of improvement within the confines of this matching task after just a week of training. So what's happening in the brain? What we're really interested in is places where the patterns start to converge for bird species that share some conceptual or taxonomic properties after participants engage in this training task. So for example, what regions are responding in a more similar fashion to these warblers on top than they are to finches, or what regions are responding more similar to within these different species of finches on the bottom. I can't give too many details, but we are finding that some of the regions here are actually in frontal cortex rather than in visual regions. And this is interesting because there's a lot of other research that is found that frontal cortex is really important for extracting generalizable information from the environment and helping you make connections across disparate contexts. So I should note that this work is really helping answer some fundamental questions about how the brain changes during learning. I like birds, so the research is particularly interesting to me, but it also turns out that birds are just a great area to study if you care about learning in the real world. So much of experimental work is based on more artificial learning studies where people learn to categorize super boring abstract shapes. And I think one reason that our bird research has been so well received in the neuroscience community is that it involves learning that is underpinned by actual curiosity and motivation, which is a good point of transition to the next section on birding and how it connects with cognitive and brain health. So in this last bit, I want to zoom out a little bit. Previously, I've been talking about some of the fundamental processes that support bird learning and identification. And next, I'll talk about a few connections between birding and cognitive health that we're interested in exploring going forward. So a basic question that we might have is, does birding have an influence on cognitive and brain health just in general, or mental health? One reason that we think that it might is that birding combines many different elements that other research has shown to be beneficial for cognition and aging and other aspects of mental health. There are elements related to learning and curiosity, exposure to nature, social connections, and there's some reasons why I think birding is actually good for autobiographical memory as well. Birding also has the potential for physical activity, although that depends a lot on how you do it exactly. So I'll go over a few of these next and just briefly touch on some of the findings that may be relevant. And this is all kind of birding in the broadest possible sense as just an interest in learning about birds. And kind of a lot of these things apply to interest in the natural world more broadly. One thing that's been kind of fascinating for me to see, and this is kind of an experiment I've been doing with myself, is just going outside and looking at birds. I found is pretty beneficial to just remembering what I've been doing. And there's a lot of research about time perception and autobiographical memory, and how having novel events and experiences are really important for segmenting time and remembering things. So especially early on in the pandemic, this was like a huge problem. Everyone was talking about how they couldn't keep things separated very much. Our physical range maybe shrank and things got very, very routine. So my unsolicited recommendation here is to go to novel locations to bird and try to notice new things. Incidentally, this has big benefits for eBird as well, where the data is particularly valuable in locations that are not frequently birded or that don't necessarily have the highest bird diversity. And after you go to new places and start to notice new things, you can take pictures and then review your lists or review the photographs you take there later on and try and reconstruct the event or reconstruct the timeline. We know that pictures are a really powerful cue, and if you can find something distinctive to latch onto that will help separate the event in the mind, that will help strengthen the memory and make it a little bit more distinctive. So I have here eBird as lazy journaling. This is kind of something that I do. Maybe take a few notes and relate it to the checklist. This whole idea is related to an ongoing study at the University of Toronto called the Hippocampus that's testing how memories can be strengthened by recording and replaying experiences. So this research isn't out yet, but it's a very promising project. And I would say that the main point here is that reviewing photos or lists is really helpful for strengthening the memory later on. And I just put up a couple of random photos that I would take, you know, even on your phone or whatever. You can take photos when you're out, just noticing new things and then kind of reviewing the photos at regular intervals. And you can really have a big impact on remembering what you've been doing recently and that you haven't always just been doing exactly the same thing. You just have to be a little bit intentional about it. The next factor is exposure to nature. This is sort of obvious, and I'm not going to say a ton about it here, although I can talk about it afterwards if people are interested. There's now accumulating research on the benefits of nature exposure, and even in a very charitable definition of nature, including kind of small urban city parks and stuff like that, there are benefits just to breaking up the continuity of daily routines and spending a little bit of time looking at something that's natural instead of this built environment that's around us. Nature exposure is also linked with the reduction in stress hormone levels and other positive mental health and memory outcomes. So there are a lot of theories about why this nature exposure is beneficial, and we're hoping that in future work we can draw on data from eBird or other sources to help us answer some of these questions about the underlying mechanisms of why nature is beneficial for these different cognitive and mental health attributes. So another thing here is social contact. Most of this work has been done kind of in modeling social networks. This slide is kind of an excuse for me just to put up this birds with friends image. There's a lot of research showing positive outcomes associated with increased social connection. And I found that birding is really a good way to meet people, and you can kind of find your friends that are gonna wake you up early in the morning if you're not great at getting up, and make sure that you get an early start, or you can find, you know, your friends that are fine to go out and look for the owls or whatever it is. It's just, it's been really, you know, I think it's a good platform or a good activity to meet with other people and have some sort of structure and outings. And I've definitely enjoyed doing different bird counts here, and just kind of meeting people and taking walks and stuff like that. The role of curiosity is really interesting. So this is research that I would say is pretty new. It's really in the early stages, but there's been some interesting findings and interesting theoretical models put forward about how maintaining curiosity across the lifespan is beneficial for brain health. Most of these models deal with neurotransmitter systems that mediate curiosity and the processing of novel information. And I think that birds really just provide this kind of endlessly. Even if you know most of the birds in your local area, there's still a lot to learn about bird behavior and migration. And then it's of course exciting to go to new places and kind of learn the birds there. So I think that this is something that's being investigated a lot now, and it's really one of the things that's been overlooked for a long time, but is really important, this role of curiosity and how that kind of promotes healthy aging and healthy brains just in general at any age. Finally, physical activity. I'm impelled to include this, not because physical activity is necessarily strongly associated with birding, as illustrated by this representative checklist here, but because exercise and cardiorespiratory health more generally are really some of the most important protective factors out there in terms of the cognitive aging literature. So some degree of elevated heart rate and exertion is important, but it doesn't have to be full out running around. This recent study, which was a random assignment study, found benefits from only brisk walking after a year. And given all the evidence out there, I've been trying to build the habit of incorporating just a little bit more physical activity in my own birding trips over the past few years, and kind of looking at the distance covered per time ratio, and trying to change that just a little bit myself. So to kind of summarize, in the first part, I talked about how neuroplasticity underpins a lot of the experience-related brain changes that allow for expertise to take shape, and that bird knowledge encompasses a range of different cognitive processes like pattern identification, separation, and integration. These processes seem to involve different frontal and temporal lobe brain regions, in addition to the more intuitive visual networks. And you can kind of track the transition and transformation of these bird representations as an index of learning over time, which has been a really promising tool. In terms of birding and cognitive health, there are many benefits to birding. This is kind of the preaching to the choir part of it. But hey, who doesn't like going to a talk that kind of affirms what you're already doing, right? So I've added to this in my own kind of practice, trying to incorporate novel locations, reviewing memories, and what I guess might be called brisk birding. So that's kind of the summary. I'll end with this last slide that mentions some of the online studies that we're doing. So we're mostly looking for birders with kind of intermediate to advanced bird ID experience. We know that this is a very squishy boundary here, and there's not kind of a hard cutoff. You can email this bird study email address if anyone wants to come to Toronto to do the brain imaging study. You're of course welcome for that. We're hoping to roll out more studies in the coming year that will expand on the range and really pull in folks from every kind of different stage of learning. But for now, we're kind of focusing on intermediate to advanced birders, And then also participants without any prior bird knowledge, we're also looking for them as well, as long as they are truly kind of novices that don't know, a medium amount about birds already. I've also had some great interactions previously with people who are interested in helping out more for the different bird studies. So if you're interested in going a little bit more in depth and kind of testing out some of these, I've had occasionally people serve as kind of volunteer bird consultants to generate ideas for new studies. And like I mentioned, it's really kind of a collaborative process with the entire birding community, helping to generate ideas for this research and really making new discoveries in neuroscience that are have been quite exciting. So I think I'll leave it off there, and I'm happy to talk about any one of these aspects in more detail afterwards. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So for everyone here, just I asked it earlier on, just in case people weren't joining us at the time. You mentioned where is the best location for people that are interested in getting involved with the study? Where would those locations be?
Yeah, so we have a couple different people working on these, and I'll just put this email address in the chat now, and you can kind of say a little bit about your background if you want, and we'll figure out the rest. What study might be good for, how long you want to participate for. Most of these are single session online studies. They're a little bit longer than the typical studies, so they're maybe be about like an hour or something, but they're split up into different sections so you don't have to go straight through, and there's a lot of instructions and details that you can get about the configuration of the studies beforehand. So you don't need much, you just need a computer and an internet connection.
Okay, perfect. And you had said roughly more intermediates, like lower advanced, but then you also appreciate some people with no real birding experience. So I guess something that I was hoping you could evaluate or explain a little bit more in depthly. I know for maybe someone that maybe they don't necessarily consider them intermediate. You mentioned number of species that they may need to know. So if you want to kind of go into that a little bit more, maybe make people feel a little bit more comfortable and interested.
Yeah, so we're definitely interested in people that have very little bird experience. We're interested in having you participate. We're planning studies in the future that are going to just take everybody, but it's kind of easier for us to start off, especially, we're submitting a lot of this data to grants and stuff to try and get more funding to increase the amount of research that we can do. We're sort of starting off at the ends of the experience spectrum, and then going forward, we're really going to develop the entire range. So this is something that I'm also interested in working with some of the other, folks at Cornell. I don't know if people have experience doing Bird Academy stuff here. They offer a lot of great courses on identification, and we're hoping to kind of fill in that kind of early learning stage. So for the studies that we have going right now, I would say kind of either very little prior bird knowledge or like more intermediate experience. And then going forward in the future, we'll probably just be modeling kind of anybody from any background.
Perfect. Okay, so to kind of go into some of the questions that people have. So I saw a comment earlier on that said, I love that you shared the info about the UK cab drivers. This article came out this year in Brain and Life regarding the study of UK cab drivers and Alzheimer's research. The hippocampus is at work, and she incorporated a link in case anyone wants to read more about it. Then Kathleen put, what an interesting study. Thanks so much for sharing this info. Heather put, you mentioned lots of studies involving visual input. Have there been any studies along the auditory pathway, as in birding by ear?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit, so it's harder to do in the MRI, but you can do them with new research, and there are other brain imaging methodologies that have done this as well. The vision science people have really dominated this, but there's great, anyone who's been out with people, I have, friends that are so, their ears are so well tuned. And you can actually you can do studies and look at the progression of sensitivity to different sound frequencies. I know there are volunteers that are helping Cornell label the bird that basically were behind the Merlin integration of auditory input. And you can detect different brain patterns that are associated with learning about different acoustic inputs. So there's interesting, and you can actually see them emerge pretty quickly after training. So similar to what I was talking about with training, after a week of training to differentiate different bird sounds, you can start to detect different coherences of neuronal populations firing. So it's a separate literature, but it's really interesting, and it obviously connects to the same thing. Somewhere there's a representation in the brain that doesn't care whether you get it, through the visual pathway or the auditory pathway. And it's interesting to look at the progression and how that emerges.
Wonderful. Yeah, another question was from Wave. She said, if someone did come to Toronto, is it a one-day session?
It is a 1-day session. Yeah, yeah, I will, if you're at all interested, I can provide you details with that. It's kind of like a full day visit to our imaging center. I mean, you're not actually doing the MRI for a lot of it, but it just but it is a single day. So if anyone has, family that they're going to be visiting or wanted to come take in the tourist sites, I just threw that up there as an option because you're not so far away.
Yeah, especially, I mean, I know I live in Livonia and it's like a 30-minute drive to the bridge over to
Yeah.
Canada. So yeah, no, it's a simple day drive, especially if people live within the Detroit metro area. Um, Lori has a question. She says, have you done any studies or planned any studies with people that have dementia?
We haven't, although we're very interested in doing that. That's a great question. One of the things is that there are different types of memory, and there are the memory for information that we've extracted, this kind of factual knowledge. A lot of the information that's kind of contained in the umbrella of bird knowledge more broadly is actually part of the memory system that's relatively well preserved in normal cognitive aging compared to more shorter term memory. So one of the things that we're interested in is looking at people that have some form of dementia and seeing if they are birders, what are they retaining, and maybe is it possible to use pieces of what you retained to actually link to other things that you're trying to remember. Because especially for people that have had this knowledge for many decades, it's actually there are cases of neurological patients that can't form new memories, but they actually can remember information that is like factual information or information related to their job or something like that, that's been very well developed. And we think that it's probably some of the same thing going on with this type of bird knowledge that's been accumulated over decades and decades.
Oh, that's awesome. So I guess kind of my question for the group would more be for those of you in the chat and whatnot, how many of you would actually be interested in participating, whether it's in person or virtual, in Erik's study? You can feel free to do just like a raise your hand. Maybe just type it into chat and say I'm interested, and then maybe incorporate your email, and that way maybe Erik can write down some emails for people if he wants to contact them, or if they want to just, again, rewrite down his email. Okay, Heather, Gwen, Ed. Okay, we're getting some Yoshi. All right, so there's definitely interest from people here. And then what's great about the recording is for those that couldn't attend live, they can watch this, learn about it, and we can share it on our Facebook page, our web page, in our newsletter, and hopefully get even more people interested in reaching out to you.
Great. Yeah, it's been so good getting ideas and feedback from people. It's really kind of a collaboration, and I sometimes get emails from people that have done a study and they say, I noticed this one thing, and then, it's not something that I was attuned to. I haven't been birding for that long, and then we'll come up with a new study idea. And now that you can do research online, it's really opened things up, and we can work with many more kind of groups than we've been able to when we had to bring everybody into the lab. So it's been a really fun set of projects for me, and I think that, you know, it's actually addressing a lot of really important questions that have been longstanding in psychology and neuroscience more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely. So another question for the group would be, are there any people that are maybe semi-interested or a little cautious but might be interested? Do you have concern? Do you have a question that maybe is something that's kind of preventing you from wanting to participate, that maybe would also help Erik moving forward reach more people that would be interested as well? Jim, you had a comment? Okay, Brianna says border crossing for those unvaccinated.
The in-person studies, I just put it up there as a thought, but we're probably expecting that most of our participants for the brain imaging stuff are going to be from the Toronto area. It is, you know, it is a drive. So yeah, the online studies, I mean, you know, if you're interested, you can just send us an email and ask for more information. The compensation for American participants that we have is actually just through Amazon gift card, because we can't do direct cash transfer. But we'll tell you more about it if you're interested, and you know, no worries if you're not. You can also pass along to friends or people, like I mentioned, that don't have any birding background. So sometimes people are like, oh, my friend is not interested in birds yet, but maybe they want to do this study, and maybe it will, you know, spark their interest. You never know what's gonna do it for people, right? So
yeah. So Wave asked a question. She asked, how long are you taking participants in each for
great question.
experienced and novice?
Yeah. So for the online studies, probably about 2 more months, I would say, or 6 weeks max. And for the brain imaging study, just because it takes so long to run, we'll probably be running that for the next like 4 or 5 months.
Okay, so plenty of time.
They can come when it's not as cold.
Okay, cool. So then I guess you mentioned that there could be some compensation for people driving out there. Do you think that if maybe a handful of people here are maybe friends and they're interested in carpooling over, what would be the number of people you could take in a max in a single day for this study? That if maybe 5 people jumped in a car and came over, is that something you're capable of doing to save gas for people?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I would say here, I'll put my personal so on the, let's see, I'll put my email in here. If that's really something that people are interested in, we'd probably have to figure out the exact configuration. And yeah, we could talk about it.
Okay. So a question for me was asked, will the recording for this event be available? They arrived late. Yes, this has been recorded. I'm planning to hopefully get this up on the website tomorrow, share it on Facebook, really just start advertising. Hopefully we can get a lot more people interested in Erik's study just to get as many participants as possible. Erik did put his email in the comments, the chat as well. So feel free to write that down if you would like to learn more, or if you're interested and you just want to jump right in and start participating. Oh, thank you, Yoshi. Keeps her quiet. But yeah, otherwise, and then another email that Erik put was for the details about the study if you'd like to learn more. So I guess any last questions from the group? If not, Erik, do you have any other last comments that you'd like to input before we close out?
No, it was great. It was great talking to you. How many people are we looking for? Usually for the online studies, usually we're looking for about 50 people in each group. So not a ton, but also since we're a little bit geographically confined to kind of like Great Lakes and surrounding regions, like we can't go to the entire world. Sure. So yeah, if you're interested, feel free to email us at the bird study thing, and we can provide more details. But thanks so
And
much for inviting me. It's really fun to give the talk, and I think it's an exciting area to be involved in.
yeah, so just so you know, there was a person that put their email for you. They're interested in the online study, but maybe if whenever your study is completed, which completed to what degree you want it to be, maybe we invite you back and we'd love to find out what your results are.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun.
Cool. All right, thank you so much, both Erik and everyone for joining. Hopefully we can get enough people that you get it well above what you need for your study.
All right, thanks again.
No problem. All right, thanks
Take care, everyone.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.